Greetings! This is Arthur Carmazzi coming to you live from Avalon here in Bali. And today we have some very special guests. We have Zeke and Selena Kosh. Selena is a neuroscientist. So Dr. Kosh and Zeke is a senior product development manager. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay, at Adobe Systems. Okay, and Adobe are the number one graphic design company in the world. And of course, neuroscience is what we're all about. So can you tell us a little bit about what you know about how people essentially, make decisions, how they interpret information?
I think the most important thing to realize is that the cortex, which is the part of the brain that you use for making higher level decisions, is made up of layers. And each of the layers deals with a higher level of abstraction. Right?
Okay.
And so if you the part we understand the best is the visual system.
That's right.
And so the first layer of the visual system which actually is in the eye, just decides whether something is light or dark. Okay? And then it does a little bit of edge enhancement, right?
There's color receptors in the eye, but yeah.
Too.
I mean, what your eye does is it just it makes a map of the world and relays that into the brain, but then your cortex actually breaks that up into its little component pieces.
Right.
And so you can.
Are,
there are colors, they are edges,
and it does
high
order,
contrast
right?
areas.
Right. So first, if you see a bunch of dark here and a bunch of light here, and when I say dark and light, I include redness here and
darker redness
here.
there or something. Yeah.
So when you get that, what you start to do is say, well, if I notice a bunch of dark here and a bunch of light here, then that's an edge, right? And edges are really important because things that you care about that you want to eat or run from are going to be made up of edges because objects are separated from the world. So that's the first place in your brain where all of a sudden you start to realize that this place out there is made up of stuff, okay? So now you have edges, and then the next layer takes those edges and composes them with shapes. Oh, so this is a round thing, right? A round thing is something where all the edges are kind of curved together. It's a square-ish thing. It's a stick.
Then
you get, go ahead.
Yeah, and then at some point, memory triggers in. Well, yeah, motion is the next one.
So then you get to motion, which is just an edge that's moving, or an object that's moving in space. So I did see the same thing here, and then I see it here, and the same thing here, so that must be something moving, right? That's all created by your brain, right? What you get in the visual system is just pixels here, pixels here.
It's a point-by-point map of the world, and then
Right, so now you start to get to like a round thing that's moving like this, and it's yellow.
Okay.
Then what your brain does is you say, well, what kind of round things are yellow that move like this do I know?
So you start to engage memory.
Right.
And those are higher brain centers, and they feed back on the lower brain centers to try and enhance the speed of processing by saying, does this thing resemble something I've seen before?
It's like a tennis ball.
And all of a sudden it'll take something that's like a partial object in your brain, in your perceptive process, and turn it into a full one. And so you can kind of skip a few steps if you use memory, this back propagation of memory onto lower brain centers to try and enhance the picture.
Right. So you're like, I saw some pixels here that might have been a square, might have been a circle, but they're moving like this and they're yellow. And your brain's like, well, I remember a tennis ball. And tennis balls are yellow and they move like that and they're round. So it goes back into the earlier parts of your visual system and it enhances. It increases the probability that you think it's round. So
That's right.
It might have been a square box flying, but if you think it's a tennis ball, you'll come back and you'll see a tennis ball. And so the question is how does that relevant to normal decision making, right? And most problems that we try to solve are insanely complex. And actually recognizing faces is insanely complex, right?
And so there's a specific part of the brain that actually works on that, isn't there?
Yeah, like a facial recognition area.
And so
in the temporal lobe.
Are facing a hard problem, whether it's a programming problem or a management problem or any sort of thing like that, the best thing to do is to actually break it into as small pieces as possible and then figure out how to solve those small pieces independently from the rest of your problems. Right, and so that idea of decomposing problems into easier problems until you get them small enough that you can solve that problem and consistently and reliably, and then add those all up, solutions to all the small pieces of the problem, and each time verifying that that's helping you get where you want to go, and then having a feedback layer from the, hey, I think our answer is sort of in this area, go back, does the work that we did down below change? No, I think it's still accurate, and then making it to higher and higher levels. That's actually how we mostly solve cognitive issues also. And that's, I think, because that's the way our brain works. And our brain does that decomposition problem because that's the most efficient and easiest way to solve problems in the world. And hearing works the same way, spatial mapping works the same way. So far, as far as I can tell, almost all of the higher level decision making that the cortex does happens in a similar way.
Excellent, excellent. Anything to add?
I think you did a great job.
Okay, so let's take that and let's break that down a little bit more. So what are the components that happen in your brain? What exactly is the brain process that's happening while you are kind of breaking things down and into these different components?
You mean in the visual system?
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, once you've got those visual that visual recognition, and you've defined the edges, you've defined the colors. Once you have, so how does the brain essentially translate that? Oh, okay. Now we've got the memory. Sorry, I just kind of like put that in your face. So now we've got the memory, but now we've got at the same time it's like, well, what if it's not in memory? So how does it create something new? What is the process internally that makes that happen?
Well, so it's trying to match what you're seeing to various things you've stored in memory, right? And when it can't do that, when like all these coincidence detectors sort of fail, I think that's when you kick in sort of your amygdala and your emotional centers that raise your level of attention and the salience, the importance of the thing. All of a sudden your brain is like, whoa, this is really important because I haven't seen this before. And then you use your hippocampus to encode a new memory. And eventually, over time, that memory will become stored in the cortex, and it will be available for the same process.
Okay, all right. And so, how does that happen? Okay, because earlier we were talking about the different receptors and some of the different neurotransmitters that are used in that process.
Right. So, the major excitatory neurotransmitter in your brain is glutamate, and it does all the heavy lifting of excitation. But when you see something new that you haven't seen before and you want to remember it, the circuit involved in detecting that, you want to make it stronger.
Okay.
And the way you do that is through a process called synaptic plasticity. And so your glutamate receptors, they're the little things that stick in the membrane. They're looking for glutamate, and they sense it. If that particular connection is important and new, you want to make it stronger. And the way you do that is by putting more of them into the membrane.
And how does that happen? How do you get more glutamate receptors?
Well, there's different kinds of glutamate receptors. So there's kind of like standard ones.
Actually,
and then there's the NMD.
Before you get to like the mechanics of how it works, I mean, I think that one of the most important things to realize is that when you think about a memory, again, rehearse a memory, what you're doing is you're sending signals out through your brain, which is this big web, right? And when you send the signals out, you're actually creating more receptors. So that the act of rehearsing a memory, thinking about it again in your brain, telling the story a second and third time, actually increases the amount of receptors, which then increases the probability that you'll be able to remember that thing again.
The receptors make you more sensitive to the glutamate.
Exactly.
So it makes you more likely to trigger that circuit if you release any glutamate.
Right, so to go back to the ball.
It makes it a more higher fidelity sort of.
Yeah, exactly. So if it's easier to think of a square circle-ish thing moving like this as a tennis ball because you've spent a lot of time playing tennis, someone else who lived in a world where they played tennis with square balls would be more likely to think that same thing was a square. But
is there such thing as a square ball?
Not technically, but there are those square, what are the beanbags?
Right.
So hacky sack, I guess, would be kind of like an example. If you play a lot of yellow hacky sack, you might think it's more like a hacky sack shape, and otherwise you think it's more like a ball shape. But the important thing is that when you rehearse a pitch or a talk or a story or whatever, you're reactivating those neurons. And the more often you do that, the stronger that those signals become, and the easier it is for you to remember those things. And so like a trick you can use for trying to remember someone's name or a place or a thing is if you think of the brain as a network and memories is all connected together as a web, and you can't get directly to the, like someone's name, what you just do is you start listing facts about them. what's their spouse, what hair color do they have, what eye color do they have, what, like where do they work.
Start
anything
triggering
like
the circuits around them.
that activates all the circuits around them. Those circuits happen to be also connected to their name, which then increases the probability that when you're searching for random names,
you can actually get there.
connect
Get
on
their
theirs.
name.
That's
Okay.
true.
And so if you think about that, then what you basically want to do is refresh and activate and keep active all of the networks around the problems that you're trying to solve, which is actually why focus and attention is so important, because what focus and attention does is allow you to continue over time to keep all the networks around whatever it is the problem you're trying to solve as active as possible. And doing that actually then increases the number of synapses, which then increases the probability that you'll be able to remember and think about those things again. So that's a positive feedback loop. So being able to control attention is probably the single most important thing for problem solving.
Excellent. And this also is
Controlling
related
attention is
to developing new competencies, isn't
That's
it?
right. Yes, of course. Yeah, any skill exactly that you want to learn, you need to be able to focus on one thing for a long period of time, which frankly all the toys and tools that we're creating now are making harder and harder.
Turn off all your notifications.
Turn off your notifications.
Okay.
And
I mean, that's useful. Yeah, it's different than the mechanics, but yeah.
And,
but it's
and
useful.
so just very useful, very useful. So anyway, continuing just with the mechanics of it, so that
Like the basic mechanics of
the
synaptic
basic
plasticity.
mechanics of synaptic plasticity.
Right.
Okay.
So
Because plasticity, let's kind of define plasticity means that you can actually change a behavior that you would normally have. So if you have a specific behavior that maybe you don't like or one that you want to create, that means that plasticity means you are able to change the behavior. Not necessarily the process, but the behavior.
Right. So changing behaviors is a more higher level complicated thing than I was about to explain.
Oh, well,
in
go
terms
ahead and
of
explain. That's all right.
Basic mechanics of synaptic
But the
plasticity.
basics, go with the basics so that we can at least
So
work with
most neurons in your brain use glutamate as our neurotransmitter, or GABA. If they're excitatory, they use glutamate. If they're inhibitory, they use GABA.
One neuron communicates to the other one by spitting chemicals.
Glutamate.
The other one sees the glutamate and gets it.
And so if you have a synapse and you want to make it stronger because it just relayed some really important piece of information and you want to be able to get to that information more easily next time, what you're going to do is there's these sort of garden variety glutamate receptors called AMPA receptors. They're just like in the synapse and they're just like out there and they're just looking for a signal. Glutamate binds them, they're like, hey, there was a signal. But then there's another kind of receptor called NMDA, which also binds to glutamate, but it has a slightly different function. And so all your AMPA receptors are clustered right there on the other side of where you spit out the neurotransmitter, and so they get the bulk of it. The NMDA receptors are kind of around the periphery of them, and so you have to have kind of a lot of glutamate spit out for them to get activated, but when they get activated, it means there was a lot of glutamate, so something important probably just happened. And they turn on and they signal a whole bunch of things inside the cell. They tell your nucleus, your genes to start replicating, and they make a whole bunch of the other kind, the garden variety AMPA receptors, and make a whole bunch of more of those and insert them into the membrane. So now you have more of those, so now you have a more sensitive synapse. They also can trigger the development of new points of communication, new synapses. And then depending on where they are, they can trigger the birth of new neurons in your hippocampus, which is hugely important for memory, like encoding new memories.
And how long does all that take?
So the first thing that happens, right?
Excellent question.
The first thing that happens is on the time scale of seconds, because you actually have pools of AMPA receptors sitting inside the cell membrane, waiting to be inserted. So they're just kind of like in the reserve. And they can just be put into the membrane, and all of a sudden you have a more sensitive thing. But then to get gene expression, where you start manufacturing more of these things, now you're talking about hours. And then if you wanted to make brand new neurons, insert them into the circuit, have them grow axons and dendrites that connect to an upstream partner and a downstream partner. Now you're talking weeks. So you have this cascade of events that happen on different time scales.
And of course, the longer you practice, the more consistent that becomes.
That's right.
So like, if you're trying to remember someone's phone number, generally you have to keep rehearsing that, right? And you have to keep rehearsing it in your brain.
Or you just put it into your phone.
Or you put it in your phone. If you want to remember something, you rehearse it, and you have to do that every couple seconds, and if you stop rehearsing it for even 10 seconds...
This is your short-term memory buffer you're talking
exactly,
about.
That
Yeah.
goes away. And so generally, if you want to really learn something, you have to start creating other networks to it, and those things take a while to happen. But by the time they're connected, if you remember something a month later, like in college, what studies have shown that if you remember something a month later, like by the time you get your test, you'll also remember when you're 70. So the vast majority of memory loss happens within an hour or two because you never actually coded that to long-term memory in the
That's
first
right.
place. Once it's in long-term memory, you pretty much have it for life. It gets a little fuzzier as you move on, but most of the
It can be
stuff
eroded,
you understand.
or it can be enhanced as well.
But if you want to learn
But
new
yeah.
habits, which tend to be motor things, where you actually need to create new connections, those things take weeks, right? So it generally takes like 2 to 3 weeks to develop a new habit. And I think that's connected to how long it actually takes to create new neurons.
Excellent. Well, this has been amazing, and I am so grateful for you guys taking the time to address our audience. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. This is Arthur Carmazzi, Selena, and Zeke wishing you great success.
Great success.
Good luck.